Adding my own background music as I start the recording. Just kidding. Yeah, welcome. It's our 10th season of Science Pub, which is kind of amazing to me. We have recordings for many of our past speakers are available on the Linda Loring Nature Foundation website at llnf.org. We also have a YouTube channel where all of our speakers and workshops and different things we've recorded are available. So you can look for the link to that on our website as well. Also on our website, you can check out all of our programs and events and things that we're doing this winter. We have Science Pub Talks, which I'll mention that the next talk is in just a minute. We also have a collaboration with the Nantucket Conservation Foundation, our Climate Change Summit Winter Edition, where we're going to have a few webinar talks and as well as wintertime field trips discussing coastal ecology and climate change around Nantucket. So I don't think that's on the calendar just yet, but we just made the registration, so those will be up later this week. You can find all that information at llnf.org on our events page and where to register for those events. Before I get into this week's Science Pub, I just want to tell you about next month because you're a captive audience. Next month, our Science Pub is on Monday, February 12th at 5:30, so the same time. This is going to be a discussion about the stewardship of xeric habitats for rare bees and moths in the northeastern U.S. with Elizabeth Crisfeld. And this is going to be highlights from a project that both the Linda Loring Nature Foundation and the Nantucket Conservation Foundation were part of for about 5 years, collecting native pollinator and moth information from some of our habitats. So I'm really excited to see that project or to hear more about that project, the results, and next month's Science Pub. If you aren't able to make any of our Science Pubs, we are recording them. And the recording from this Science Pub will be available later this week on our website, and we'll email everyone who registered to send you that link as well. So a few logistics before we get started. We are recording, as we're all notified. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat. We did figure out to enable everyone to be able to use the chat. There is a Q&A feature on the webinar as well. In an unusual turn of events, I'm actually going to be presenting today. I'm usually the host, but I'm also presenting on some work that we're doing, which I'll tell you about in a little bit. So if there are any technical difficulties or you're having problems hearing me or anything like that, please put something in the chat. Kristen is going to be monitoring the chat and for any problems like that. And then she can also hop on and cut me off if I need to address something. Otherwise, if you have a question during the talk, feel free to put it in the chat. And then when I'm done, we'll kind of go through all those questions as they kind of in the order they came in on. So once again, I am Sarah Bois. I'm the Director of Research and Education here at Linda Loring, and I'm really excited to be starting Science Pub this year, our 10th season, telling you all about a project we've been working on. You know, they kind of broke ground on this project 5 years ago in 2018, but we've been in the planning process for a long time. So it's really fun to talk about the highlights of projects that we've been doing for quite a while. So without any further ado, I am going to share my screen and get started. All right. Assuming my phone will start going off, if there's a problem, or Kristen will jump in. So I'm going to talk today about some pine management, some invasive pine management we've been doing here at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation with a focus of restoring grassland habitat. And ultimately, this is going to help create a more resilient habitat and help our globally rare habitats be more resilient into the future. So before I get into the pines, I want to talk about some of the motivation for this work. As many of you may know or have heard talks before, Nantucket and many other parts of the coastal New England are home to our sandplain grassland habitat. Now, sandplain grasslands are globally rare habitats, which, relative for their size, they have very high biodiversity, especially in rare and endangered flora and fauna in the Northeast. This map is from a recent paper on sandplain grassland habitats. And you can see the red dots are or the reddish orange dots are the remnant sandplain grassland habitat in the Northeast. And so basically Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, Long Island, and pockets of the Cape Cod National Seashore and other parts of Cape Cod host most of the sandplain grassland habitat. And so this has been a conservation priority in the region and definitely the state and specifically our local area of Nantucket. So on Nantucket, when we think about sandplain grassland habitat, we also think about coastal heathlands. So those are two distinct habitat types, but they share a lot of species in common. So we think of them in partnership in terms of management. This map on the right that has the green shade, the green shade are all the remaining sandplain grassland and coastal heathland properties on Nantucket. And you can see that there's a lot on the south coast. There's a little bit on the north, pockets throughout the middle moors. And so these are conservation priorities for us on Nantucket, as I mentioned. They're host to a lot of rare flora like the New England blazing star and sandplain blue-eyed grass, among many others. Rare Lepidoptera, so this is the chain dot geometer, but there's lots of other Lepidoptera species that rely on these habitats. And then we have many grassland-dependent bird species that are, need either all grassland or some combination of grassland to perform their breeding behaviors. And so at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation, this map shows where we are located on the island on the western end. We have 275 acres of diverse habitats, and we're open for passive recreation. And so this is, the yellow is our boundary. So you're going to be seeing a few versions of this types of map for about 275 acres around the north head of Long Pond. And it might not look like a huge acreage compared to some other areas, but even within this boundary, we have a number of different habitat types. And so we have about 53% of our 275 acres is that sandplain grassland coastal heathland mix. And so in this map, that kind of light green is the grassland and heathland plant community. However, this map, this habitat map was, this one I'm using in this picture was first created in the late 90s, early 2000s. And so there's a lot more grassland in this picture than when I first started at Linda Loring in 2014, what I experienced. I experienced a lot more of the pine habitat. And so in terms of our management goals as landowners is to encourage and increase these rare habitats of sandplain grassland. So how do we do that? Well, first, in order to manage or increase or, protect something, we first need to know what the threats are. So if we have the sandplain grassland habitat, how are we to protect it? What are the threats to sandplain grassland habitat? So there's habitat loss due to development and fragmentation, natural ecological succession. So these are early successional habitats. They need disturbance. And then invasive species. So both new and existing threats of invasive species that can take over an area. And then there's another suite. I kind of divided these threats into two halves. The other suite of threats I think about are impacts related to climate change. So another type of habitat loss is when we have erosion. We also have seawater inundation from sea level rise and storm surge. And then there's additional climate impacts that affect species, range shifts, and management changes, et cetera. I'm not going to go into all those details, but as a land manager, when I think about what can I control and what can I do, how can I protect these habitats, I might focus first on these top 3 threats because they're things I can maybe do something more about. And if I reduce those stressors of those first 3 threats to sandplain grassland habitats, then I can overall increase the resiliency as our habitats naturally will be experiencing the impacts of climate change. So instead of going through all these different threats and everything that we're doing for sandplain grassland habitats, today I'm just focusing on invasive species and how we're removing one of the biggest invasive species threats on our property at the Linda Loring Nature Foundation. So the species I'm focusing on tonight is Japanese black pine. So Pinus thunbergii is the Latin name if you're curious. And so when I think of resiliency of our property and those sandplain grassland habitats, we think once again, what change can we affect? And so reducing the stress of Japanese black pine has become a target goal for me. And was something that we started working on and planning for in 2016, 2017. So thinking about Japanese black pine, so why is it invasive? Why is it a problem? So the first step of being invasive is not being native to the area. And there's a lot of discussions lately about what's native and how can you define nativity. And there's species that are moving with climate change. But this is a species that is native very far from our in North America in general, but very specifically New England and Nantucket, and was brought to the US and Nantucket specifically to be planted. So it wasn't a natural occurrence. It's native to Japan, South Korea, and it's found in parts of coastal China. It is salt tolerant, salt spray tolerant. It loves open, sandy, nutrient poor habitats, perfect for coastal Nantucket, and it grows very fast. So it was introduced to the US from Japan in 1855, and it was first planted on the Cape and Islands in the late 1800s. And some of the reasons it was planted was because it was a really great windbreak. So if you needed something to grow fast, to block wind and establish well, that was something that was kind of readily planted in the horticultural trade. It was also planted extensively in Delaware and on the coastal Delaware, where it's also considered a problem. So when we think about an invasive species, not only is it not native, but it has to cause some kind of problem. There's economic, ecological harm. And so not only is it not native, but it can be considered a fire hazard. It spreads into open grassland habitats, which I'll show you in a minute. And it can crowd out our native pitch pine species. And pitch pines are, specifically on Nantucket, are a roost tree for a federally endangered northern long-eared bats. So another habitat that we really want to protect. And the other thing is that Japanese black pine is an alternate host for the southern pine beetle, a highly invasive species that's destroying pine habitat. So with all that going against it, the other thing that happens for a Japanese black pine, this picture is taken from, excuse me, from the Linda Loring Nature Foundation property, is as a non-native species, it is susceptible to some of our pests, our native pests. And so through the turpentine beetle that can affect it, which is a native species, it can become standing dead. So a lot of times when you see older Japanese black pine stands, you'll see a stand like this where there's a mix of live and dead trees that can become a significant fire hazard or a human health hazard. This map I made in 2021, so it could probably stand to be updated. But this is just showing where in the United States there are the introduced range of Japanese black pine. As I mentioned, Delaware and North Carolina in particular, the coastal islands, have a problem in areas where in the 1940s, 1950s, during the works programs post World War II, a lot of pines were planted and are now being actively removed. This doesn't mean that there aren't pines in the other states. It just means that this is where there's a lot of documentation. And I'll get into documentation in a minute. This is a recent map. I actually just looked at this weekend on iNaturalist. So if you're not familiar with iNaturalist, it's a distribution database and app you can get on your phone where you can record any types of life anyway. But this is just for Japanese black pine. And you can see the distribution in coastal New England. You can see Nantucket, Cape Cod, New Jersey, and South, and Long Island. So basically a lot of similar areas to where we have sandplain grassland habitat in these coastal areas. This is where Japanese black pine has been documented. On Nantucket, all these green little dots are representing recorded occurrences of Japanese black pine. And once again, this doesn't mean that there aren't Japanese black pine in the other areas or other parts of the coast, just means this is where people have recorded information, specifically on iNaturalist. And so just to get you familiar, if you've walked around Nantucket and you've seen some of these habitats, this is what you're looking at, Japanese black pine. These top two photos are both from Linda Loring. And what I want you to there's two things I want you to notice from these pictures. First is that they are a mix of live and standing dead or almost dead. So there's like, live green pine trees that look healthy. There's pine trees that have brown needles, so they're in the process of dying or dehiscing. They're shedding their needles. And then there's standing dead, so there's bare trees barren of needles, so those are standing dead. The other thing too is that there's both grassland habitat underneath, and then there's shrubland habitat underneath. So they kind of invade lots of different habitats. This is a scraggly picture that has a lot more dead and standing dead and than other areas. And then this is from Sconset, where there's Japanese black pine in the dunes and the dune system. Those look more healthy. And then I just wanted to have this close-up one. This was from an iNaturalist photo taken from, I believe, Tupancy Links, where there's also Japanese black pine. And what I like is you can see very clearly in this picture the two needles. So if you're wondering if you have Japanese black pine or another pine species, usually pitch pine is the one that they kind of get confused. The Japanese black pines, the one we don't want, has bundles of needles in two. So there's two needles in a bundle. Pitch pine has 3 needles in a bundle. And so if you take anything away from this presentation, you can remember my stupid rhyme that I tell everybody when they come to Linda-Loring for a walk is needles 2, out with you. Needles 3, let it be. So it works for poison ivy. It works for Japanese black pine. Needles 3, let it be. That's usually the pitch pine. And if needles 2, that's Japanese black pine, and that's a species you want to get rid of. So as I mentioned, documentation is really important. So the first step before we do any kind of management is wondering how much do we have? Where are the pines? Where do we want to focus our efforts? And so this map has a mixture of the sandplain grasslands. That's that background light green. And then there's the light blue are occurrences of Japanese black pine. So the polygons that are the slash marks are areas that we've managed, which I'll go over. And so those are kind of bigger stands. And then the triangles are individual trees that were recorded by some volunteers and interns. To show the spread of Japanese black pine, they were planted along the road initially in the 1940s, 1950s as a windbreak, and they have since spread south throughout the property. But I also wanted to show this because it shows where that overlap of sandplain grassland habitat and pine habitat is. So before I get into the data and like the fun stuff of what we did and what we found, I wanted to show what practically is it? Like, what are we doing when we say we're managing Japanese black pine? Sometimes I just say black pine. Well, with the best method that we have found for Japanese black pine management is actually physical mechanical removal. So because Japanese black pine, many invasive species respond differently to different types of management. We found with mechanical removal, we don't need to use any chemicals or herbicides. It's really having a crew come out, chainsaw, cut individual trees, chip all the trees up and remove the chips from the site. This does include the pine cones and other reproductive material. Because when we first started this work, we, at Linda-Loring, we have a small staff. It's a lot to take on with these bigger stands. We were awarded a state wildlife habitat management grant that allowed us to hire a crew to do this work. In doing so, we wanted to stretch those grant dollars as far as possible. So cut the biggest acreage of Japanese black pine. So one of our choices that we made was to not remove the stumps, or if you're familiar with these terms, stump grinding, that's going to take a very long time and is really disturbing to the habitat to remove all those stumps. It's necessary in some cases with certain species, but we wanted to test out some of these methods. In 2018, when we were first starting it, there wasn't a lot of documentation about what the best removal methods for Japanese black pine were. So by not removing the stumps, our grant dollars went a lot further acreage-wise, and we were able to monitor whether or not there was grow back from these stumps. And I'm happy to report there was minimal to no resprouts from any stumps in the Japanese black pine removal projects. So what it looks like in the immediate aftermath. So this is one of our bigger acreages that we managed, and I'll show you how we've kind of piecemealed this together. But I just wanted to show some quick images of what it looks like. So we first remove pines, and we're cutting and chipping. I say we. I didn't do this work. Our hired contractors did, and they do a fantastic job. There's a lot of disturbance to that habitat. There's the trucks and the dump trucks and chippers driving over the area. There's the physical, like cutting the trees. There's the, dragging the limbs and the trees around. Then there's putting them in the chipper. It looks pretty scary sometimes. It's like, did I make the right decision? Are we going to be restoring this habitat? Obviously, we did make the right decision, or I wouldn't be giving a presentation about it today. But it doesn't look great that very first moment after cutting. And then typically the next growing season, I chose this photo to show you with one of those stumps, what it looks like after it's kind of been hanging around for a little while. And as I mentioned before, some of this was testing these methods. How long does it take that stump to decay? Is it going to resprout? What are the species that are going to come in as we open up that canopy? And in this picture too, you can see that there are grasses and some forbs, wildflowers coming in and sprouting up, but there's also still a lot of open bare ground and a needle thatch layer from all those decades of pine needles. And then over time, as more things come in, the grasses come in, forbs come in, and then some of our native surrounding low growing shrubs like huckleberry, blueberry, a little bit of bayberry, and then some of our rubus species, blackberries and dewberries will kind of come into the area too. But all low growing native vegetation. And then we follow up, right? So even though we have our huge contractors that come in to do the big bulk of the work, we follow up with some of the smaller areas with our volunteer crews, our summer interns. And this was a group of Mass Audubon students who were coming out for a work program that came out and did a lot of Japanese black pine clipping. So we can incorporate the management to other programming that we do here at Linda Loring. So the most fun part of this project are the before and after photos. So this was one of our first areas that we managed in the fall of 2018. This was a picture of, you can see there's sort of a trail on the left-hand side. There's a wall of Japanese black pine in a mix of live, about to die, and standing dead trees. There's grass and low-growing huckleberry in the foreground. And then that following growing season, the summer of 2019, you can see that the bulk of the trees are gone. So that like wall of trees is gone. And the grasses have come back. They didn't go anywhere. And then there's the low shrubs are still around. In the background of this 2019 picture, you can see another stand of Japanese black pine in the distance. That has since been also removed. But this was one of our first test cases where we really wanted to see if we could accomplish the results that we were hoping for. So I just wanted to show you a version of a time lapse of some of the Japanese black pine. So this is one of the very first areas that we managed for Japanese black pine because it's right next to our office. So hopefully you can see the cursor. This building, this is our office. This is the driveway in, if anybody of you have been here, to the Linda Loring Nature Foundation. And this aerial is from 2001. And what I want you to pay close attention to is right at the edge here of this, our property boundary, there's a number of dark green spots. Those are pine trees. Most of them are Japanese black pine. There's a few pitch pines mixed in. But you can see how there's a smattering. There's like a bunch right by the office. There's a few down to the southwest, but it's not too bad. So flash forward, technology gets a little better. Here's another aerial from 2012, so 11 years later, and you can see this pine area has grown significantly. It's also a pretty healthy stand in 2012. There may be a few little dead spots in the middle, but this is a pretty healthy, I know from being on the ground here that most of this is Japanese black pine. 2015, there's still, you know, like quite a bit of pine in here. That's what the darker green is. And obviously these are different times of year, as you can see surrounding green, but this is what was available to me to make these. And then 2018 is when you really start to see, between 2015 and 2018, there's a lot more dead trees. So there's some brown bits that are dying trees where there's like brown needles. There's a lot of gray branches where you can see those standing dead trees. And that's, you know, this is a stand that is in the process of dying. And being so close to not only our office, but our neighboring houses, this is creating a fire hazard. It's also an area where we have lots of kids programs and things. So we want to remove the hazard as well as restore the ecological function of this area. So between 2018 is when we started this project. And this was one of the first areas that we removed trees. And flash forward to 2021, where this area has been removed of Japanese black pine. There's grasses. The darker colors now here, these are shrubland areas. And this area has both visually as well as through the data we've collected has been recovering as a grassland heathland mix. And so this is actually from the ground. So actually, I'm going to step back once. So pretend you're standing at the corner of the deck right here and looking west, southwest. That's what this picture is. So pre-management, this was looking from that corner of the deck where there's a mix of live and dead pines. And then the photo below is what happened basically right after management. So you can see 3 main stumps that are kind of in the brown grass. You can see lots of debris. There's you know, wood chips and pine cones and all sorts of debris things. And then excuse me. And then the growing season later, or actually this is a year and a half later, during the growing season, you can still see those 3 stumps, but you can see also the green coming in. And so while it looks beautiful and you can have a much more of a vista of the rest of the landscape, and you can see there's a lot of growth and green. I'm going to show you some data in a minute, but we have, you know, these are all native species that are coming in. We're monitoring for other non-natives that can come in with disturbance. And so these visuals are really stunning, but it's also kind of continuing to go back over the habitat that really helps us measure success. And so just some of the bullet points here was we're restoring the natural wind and salt spray regimes that are found in these areas. We have monitoring for the native habitat recovery. And once again, we're reducing that fire risk that was especially in those areas that are near houses and buildings. And then just for, so you know how we are able to do this, over the years, we've been successful in multiple grant funding opportunities in 2018 and in 2022. 2022, 23, we received state funding through the Wildlife Habitat Management Grants Program. We've had funding from a private organization, the Robert Schumann Foundation, and then we had the Xeric Habitat Conservation Project looking at native pollinators, which we're going to be hearing about next month. That project supported some of the management efforts in this area too. So going back, you've seen this map before where we had the, you know, sandplain grassland, green areas in the background, and the blue areas on top are where we have, excuse me, are where we have Japanese black pine or had Japanese black pine. And because, you know, knowing where the species are across the landscape is really important to help us prioritize our management efforts as we go along. But we obviously, or maybe obvious to me, we aren't able to do it in one go. So even though we know it's a problem, we have to parse out like how doing the management between the funding opportunities as well as the contractor availability. And so in 2018, we did the population near our office and then a population to the west that were relatively small areas. We started with these small populations that were easy to get to, both because of the fire hazard, as I mentioned, that they pose to our offices, but also they were small enough that we could monitor in a more intensive way and create an adaptive management plan where we could see how it went. Are we successful? Do we want to use these same methods moving forward? So then in 2019, we took a bigger chunk by the road. That's along Eel Point Road. 2020, we started to do a little bit on the eastern side, basically just to make some of that property more accessible. 2021, we took our biggest chunk, which was this really big area that was about 5 to 7 acres in total on the western side. And then most recently completing, and I say completing, but we did the bulk of the work in 2023, where this larger area was removed. And I'll show some pictures of this and what we've done. But I wanted to show you that it's not, one fell swoop. It's over time, kind of putting these things together to remove the pines from the larger landscape. And I didn't put a separate slide in here, so I do want to point out at this moment, because on this map, at the top of the map, you can see where the ocean is. So if you haven't been here before, you can see how close Nantucket Sound is, just on the other side, basically on the other side of Eel Point Road and right up there. And so, especially this time of year, we have these nor'easters, we have a lot of northeast wind, and even the offshore breezes in the growing season. So a lot of that wind and salt spray is what shapes these habitats. So not only the Linda Laurie Nature Foundation, where we are here, but anything along the coast is really these normally or typically low growing grassland, heathland habitats, and even our low shrublands are really shaped by these processes. So in planting a Japanese black pine to be a wind block, that might work if, for a homeowner, but if your goal is ecological restoration, you really want to restore that ecological process. And so the management action was cutting a tree, but what it does is it opens the canopy and creates an open ground for plant growth, but it also restores the wind and salt spray to the habitat. So you can't see I'm doing all these hand movements. I didn't put a good diagram in for that. Sorry about that. And as I said, restoration is adaptive. As we were going through this with the smaller areas, we were seeing what worked in these landscapes and what kind of grow back there was. So a couple of things I really want to point out that were successful and helped us with the restoration and grant dollars was we did not do any seed addition. So when we first got that very first habitat management grant from the state, there was a lot of discussion with the state restoration ecologists about whether or not we were going to be adding seed. Now, adding seed is very expensive, both actually, financially and just the dollars, but also the time, whether to collect seed on site and then to distribute seed and monitor grow back. We wanted to see if not adding seed would be successful. If we had added seed from the very beginning, we would never know that we didn't need to add seed. And so by not adding seed and monitoring the grow back, we were able to feel confident that over time, the native vegetation would fill in the gaps that were left by the Japanese black pine removal. We followed up stewardship with raking and cone removal. So every year we have a number of volunteers who work with us, both on island residents and summer visitors that work with us. And we do a lot of stewardship in terms of raking up needles, removing pine reproductive material, mainly pine cones, and then also plucking out any seedlings that do sprout. We do visual surveys for rare and other invasive species. So typically with a disturbance like this, I showed some of those images of like what the area looks like after this disturbance. There's a worry of other non-native invasive species coming in. And we did have some honeysuckle come in, and some miscanthus, which is a Chinese silvergrass, which is a non-native species. And they were a few that we could pull out individually. So by monitoring them immediately and every summer after or every growing season, we're able to minimize the invasive species occurrences. And we also are doing visual surveys for additional rare species that may be occupying these habitats. And I'll show some of those results as well. The first couple of years, as I mentioned, because we were doing an adaptive restoration where we were wanting to know if our methods were going to be working, we did a lot of vegetation transects. I'm not going to show the data for every single plot, but basically they look really similar to this. So we have vegetation transects. So each polygon or each stand of trees that we removed, we had a number of transects across, and we monitored them for at least 3 years. And what we were looking at for was grow back. So the number one thing, a measure of success, is we did not have any pine grow back. So that was great. We have separate data that showed ground cover recovery because we went from needles and chips to open bare ground and plants. But I just wanted to point out these bar graphs, because what we're looking at is recovery after cutting. So that year 0 is right after everything was cut. And basically the only thing that is found is graminoids, so grass type plants. There's a little bit of woody because our blueberries are growing very low, and our rubus, which is our dewberries and blackberries, are a little viney, and so they can grow over these areas, but there's very little woody. And over time, what we find is that graminoid, that grass cover, increases, as do the forbs. The forbs are like wildflowers. And in the office area, the phase 1 that we showed that time lapse for, we had a recovery. And by year 3, the graminoids diminished a bit, and then we got some more woody, but these are targeted woody. So these aren't, when I say woody, it's like shrubs. These aren't pines. We like separated out the pines in the data, and there weren't any pines that were coming back in. So we were really happy with these results. Similarly, the overlook area, we had a recovery. These actually became more shrubby than grassy, but they were, once again, huckleberry and blueberry, so native heathland plants that we were really happy with. And these are all native species. We had a few, as I mentioned, honeysuckle that came in, and that was really the only invasive species that came into those management areas. And the other areas were very similar to this. Although collecting this type of data, while very important, is very labor and time intensive. So we did this for 3 years for our first couple of phases, phase 1, 2, and 3. And in successive years, because of the success of this, we were able to kind of sunset the transects and work in other ways to monitor success. So as we moved into this area on the western side, in 2019, we were really focusing on this western side, where there was a kind of our bigger stand. And this was an area that is closer to the ocean. Like you can directly see the water in that lower right picture, where we were really focused on restoring that wind and salt spray regime. And so this is kind of reiterating some of the same but different pictures. And you can see in the top left, you can see the telephone pole right there, or the electric lines. And you can see that same electric line in the lower picture. And so you can see, some of the huckleberry that's low, that's growing in this lower right corner. You can see the graminoids, the grasses, mostly carex or little blue stem. So some of our native species that are really grassland specific. We do have some of these, what we call fireweeds, that are early colonizers. They come in right after disturbance, and then they kind of blip out. And we were able to see that with our transects, that over time, they kind of come in and bust out, and then the more established heathland and grassland vegetation comes back in. Another way that we monitored success was through monitoring for grassland-specific bird species. I don't have all the results of this project yet. My colleague Seth Engelborg, really, this was his project, where we had some funding from the Robert F. Schuman Foundation to restore some of these pine areas in the name of grassland bird species. And so on this map, you see these like blue dots. Those are the centroids of survey areas, where before management and multiple years after management, we surveyed for all the bird species in the area, both orally, so birds that you could hear, and then birds that were seen at each spot throughout the breeding season. And the goal is to increase grassland habitat to support many of the grassland specific species that are highlighted in the Massachusetts State Wildlife Action Plan. I know from we're working on these data right now, because it's the field work was completed in 2023, and we're kind of mining through all the data. And one thing we're immediately finding is that the bird species didn't decline. So our management, at the very least, our management has not caused any decline in any of the bird species. in the area. If what we're hopeful for is that our target species will have increased or stayed stable. We do have many northern harriers in the area. We have barn owls that are have barn owl nest boxes in the area adjacent to our property too. And so we'll be reporting more about this project in the coming year. But all of that to say, so all of the transects and the bird work and the success we had with managing the black pine without resprouts has really encouraged us to take on this largest trunk. So the area at 90 Eel Point Road, so that's the address of this driveway. As you can see, this faint blue line was a polygon that I walked around the kind of perimeter of the Japanese black pine stands. And we got specific funding for this project from a state wildlife habitat management grant, and that was the most recent one. And it's kind of the most significant acreage for us to kind of take out. And so it was more of an undertaking, but we had done the work ahead of time to show that we could be successful without adding seed and without grinding the stumps. So this is what a lot of that property looked like. So on the kind of eastern side of that driveway, a lot of the stands look like this. So some really tall Japanese black pine trees, some of the tallest I've ever seen, many of them standing dead, then a lot of dead debris down, and then new sprouts coming in. It was, very complicated for our contractors to work through that. Not only different age stands, but different stages of decay. So there were some really big stumps that were actually quite spongy. And so it was a lot of discussions about how to remove that to be able to open up that canopy. And because we have sunset the transect aspect, we really wanted another good way to monitor success and monitor regrowth. So we transitioned to these more sophisticated photo points where we could go back to the exact location, not just have a stake in the ground, which is what we did before. So this next series of, because the before and after photos are my favorite, this photo point is from November of 2022. And so you can see, once again, the mix of live and standing dead, different size and age structures of that Japanese black pine with the grassland and shrubland mix in the foreground. And then February of 2023, so, only so many months later, you can see from the exact same point, the grass in the foreground, and then all of the debris from removing those trees. And honestly, without these photo points, it would be really hard to tell that these are the same spots because it's so different when you open up the habitat. But then June of 2023, we went back to take photos of these areas and see, after one growing season with minimal follow-up, how successful are these locations in recovering. And so you can see some bigger pines in the distance. These are pitch pines, which we left. And then you can see this open grassy habitat. Now from the side, it looks really great when you can kind of see some of these open pockets of chips and debris that we're going to be working with and through. Similarly, here is a fewer overall Japanese black pine, but this is looking southwest, you can see, towards the pond. So this is the north head of Long Pond. You can kind of see on the side. That's once again November. This is February after the trees have been cut. You can see the osprey pole now. But then following up in June of 2023, you can see the ospreys are on the pole, but you can also see the open grassland habitat that is available. And then this is one of my favorites. This once again at 90 Eel Point Road. This is an old road which we use as a trail that cuts through the pine. And you can see there's a very dense stand of pine on the north side. And then on the south side, there's kind of a lot of dead sporadic trees. This is one of the most kind of awestruck to me differences, because this is now, you can kind of see, hopefully you can see my cursor, you can kind of see the remnant of that path, and then the very openness of the landscape without all of the trees. And, there's still restoration work and stewardship to be done here to rake up a lot of these needles and pine cones. But you can see the open, I'm saying grassland over and over again, because what you can see is grass, but there's a lot of diversity of mix of species within here. So one of the other successes and things that we had to look out for were some rare species. So I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk some of our rare grassland species, like sandplain blue-eye grass. So Scissorincium fuscatum is a state-listed species of special concern, which we do monitor. Once again, on this map is that little blue area is the kind of pine coverage. And these purple dots are where sandplain blue-eye grass have been found. And this particular area, if you can see my cursor, is where that photo was taken of the path where all these trees were removed. And so not only do we have the before the trees were removed, where all the Scissorincium are, and we managed in the wintertime when they were dormant, we're going to be monitoring the grow back and where these species are, where these individuals and where the population will end up in the future. And so we know that this species thrives on disturbance. So we might have my anticipation, my supposition is that we're going to have a spike in the number of species in the next couple of years, the number of individuals rather, in these areas, and hopefully we'll be able to encourage more growth of the Scissorincium into the future as we open up this habitat and create more available space for these rare species. So since 2018, what have we found? So we removed approximately 25 acres of Japanese black pine. 25 acres doesn't seem like a lot, but 25 acres is the actual number, like area of just trees. And so we actually feel like we've restored about 150 acres because of removing those trees where that natural wind and salt spray can actually get to now the effective area. And then we, have this native habitat recovery without grinding stems and without seed addition that has been, able to show that this type of restoration can be done without herbicide as well. And so therefore can have, a great ecological effect on the landscape and have our grant dollars go a lot further. And also we've been able to reduce that fire risk in the area by removing a lot of these dead and dying trees. And I put this picture in here to remind me to share with you. This is a pink lady slipper orchid, and you might notice it's growing in a bed of pine needles. One of the surprising things that we found doing our transects was that we had a number of the pink lady slipper orchids come up in post tree cutting. So we cut trees, and that very next summer we had a number of pink lady slipper orchids come up when we opened the canopy. So acidic soil, these were in the seed bank and came up in that first year in 2018 or 2019 after cutting. The unfortunate thing is we weren't expecting them, so we didn't count individuals. We just, if they were on the transect, and we noted a few. And then in subsequent years, we counted over 50, not all blooming, of course, but we had over 50. They've since sort of stabilized. So, we didn't collect the best data on that because it was sort of anecdotal that we observed it. So I'm hoping as we have cut more area, if we find more lady slippers, we're going to be doing a more intensive survey of them. And then other observations in the newly cut area, the kind of bigger acreage, we have northern harrier, which is one of our target bird species. It was hunting actively over the area for a long time. This is just the one great photo we got of it hunting over the newly cut area. It would not have been able to hunt or use this area as a pine stand. And then, of course, the sandplain blue-eye grass, which I mentioned before, we've had a lot coming up in the area that we're driven over, and we're going to be kind of continuing to monitor that in the coming years. And then our pink lady slipper orchids, I did want to include, the orchids themselves are so beautiful that you want to have pictures of them flowering, but of course many of them are as just the basal stems without the flowers, so we had a lot of those as well. And this one is a blurry picture, but what I love about it is that you can see the real focus is on the background where we've cut all the trees and there's all the debris, and this little lady slipper orchid is coming through. And as we wrap up, I just want to say another success of this project was really highlighting the invasiveness of Japanese black pine. So while we knew Japanese black pine to be invasive, and we as an organization prioritize management of this species, it was not on the prohibited plant list for the state. So in 2021, we proposed Japanese black pine as well as a few others And I'm happy to say that that was successful. And so now Japanese black pine is listed as an invasive species, and it's on the prohibited plant list for Massachusetts. And that helps in terms of it no longer being used as a landscape plant, because even though it doesn't look great, it was still used as a landscape plant for some time. And then helps also with funding dollars for it to be officially an invasive species. It helps with some funding opportunities. And I just want to end with some positive thoughts about what people can do, what anyone can do, not just for Japanese black pine, but for other species you might be concerned about. So both removing and or managing them in your own home or yard. And I think one thing that gets overlooked that is very important is documentation. So I'm happy to talk to anyone about using iNaturalist. It's very, very easy, and all you have to do is take a picture of something. You don't even need to know what it is. But if you do think you have some Japanese black pine and you put it on iNaturalist, that will help us as researchers and managers know where all the individuals are. It helps with a lot of different types of research. But also when we were proposing that species as an invasive to the state, they look at iNaturalist to know how widespread a species actually is. So documentation is very important. Supporting native habitat recovery, and then keeping an eye out for signs of southern pine beetle infestation. As I mentioned, Japanese black pine is a secondary host for southern pine beetle and has been found on the island. And so we want to, the more we kind of keep an eye out, the more healthy all of our pitch pine and other pine stands can be. I'm not going to go into details on the southern pine beetle, but just to know that the Nantucket Conservation Foundation has really great resources about southern pine beetle, what to look for. And I just wanted to, make sure I mentioned the importance of healthy forest systems, and removing non-natives like Japanese black pine are part of creating a healthy forest. And lastly, if you do want to know more about this project or follow along as we make updates, on our website, we have a story map, which talks about all aspects of this project. We'll be continuously updating it. It's on our website. My favorite thing, as I love the before and after photos, is on the actual story map, this is a slider where you can do the before and after and look how things have changed. We have lots of additional information. And as we go through the bird data, for example, we'll be adding information to the story map. So you can follow along as we continue to remove individual Japanese black pines and document the recovery of these habitats. And with that, I just want to thank everyone for coming here today, listening to me talk about Japanese black pines. Hopefully I didn't mumble too much, and I hope that you had some good takeaways. All right. I see that there are some questions, or let's see, I'm going to stop sharing. All right. It's so weird not doing this in person, because then I'm like, and I'm done. Is anyone still here? No. Thanks, everybody. All right, so I'm just going to go through some of the chat. All right. Okay, one of the questions was, how do you tell the difference between Japanese black pine and native pitch pines? I did mention that in the talk, but just to reiterate, there's a few different characteristics which you can look up in a book or something, but to me, the easiest ones here on Nantucket is to look at the needle bundles. So when you look closely at a pine, any kind of pine, the needles will be in little bundles, so they'll be like connected together at the base. And a bundle of 2 is Japanese black pine typically, and a bundle of 3 will be pitch pine. So of course, if you look at a branch, you want to look at a few bundles just to make sure you don't have a weird one, but that's kind of the best immediate way. All right. Oh, good. Kristen said it. Sorry. Some of these are the same. Okay, what were the species of grasses and grass-like plants that came in after clearing the Japanese black pines? That's a great question. And the kind of follow-up, what was the diversity? Yeah, so ruderal species, so like kind of like those species that like kind of disturbed areas, think of roadside species, A lot of times those are the first species to kind of come into a new disturbance. But I think it really depends on what the surrounding vegetation is. And so because we have very few, aside from the Japanese black pine, here at Linda Loring Nature Foundation, we actually have very few non-native species like in the landscape. And that's because it's not bisected, it hasn't had a lot of management or disturbance in general. And so the surrounding vegetation and what I was presuming in the seed bank was kind of what is already there. And so for the graminoids, the grass-like species, we had Carex pennsylvanica, which can become kind of dominant. It's a native, so that is becoming kind of dominant. We had a few different species of agrostis. We had so little blue stem, Schizocarium, scoparium. I don't know if like, so little blue stem grass, which is kind of the signature grass of grasslands or sampling grasslands, has started to come in. It's a bunch grass, so it doesn't kind of colonize as quickly as the Carex pennsylvanica. But if you're, I don't know who actually asked the question. So if you have more specific questions about exact species and data, please feel free to email me because I'm happy to share any of the information. I think part of it in that adaptive restoration framework of testing our methods was knowing what you have to start with, right? So knowing that we didn't have like garlic mustard right next door or euphorbia or, you know, some of the really invasive things that are kind of waiting for some disturbance to come in. So I felt really confident in what we were doing. We did have, as I mentioned, the honeysuckle. It's bird dispersed, so birds flying over the area very easily could, you know, poop the seeds out. Or if the seeds are already in the landscape, opening up that canopy will let them come out too. So we do have some spotted knapweed along Eel Point Road, but it hasn't, I'm like knockwood, hasn't come into the interior of the landscape yet. We've been managing it on the roadside. So I think that's something that we are also looking out for. Are there plans to treat these restored grasslands with prescribed fire? So that's a great question. You know, I would love to have fire on this landscape, especially as the previous question was talking about grasses. And one of the native grasses that has come in is Carex pennsylvanica, so Pennsylvania sedge, and it's dominant, right? It covers an area. And if left for too long unmanaged, then that species, while not invasive, will cover the area and it'll be hard for other species to come in. I would love to burn that landscape. We aren't set up as an organization right now between liability and the ability to put fire in the ground. We're not set up. I have historically been part of the prescribed fire crew on Nantucket. So Nantucket does have an active prescribed fire crew, but not to put a damper on it. But you know, the use of fire as a tool is one of the management techniques that has been impacted by the impacts of climate change. So drier summers, more unpredictable weather in terms of wind, have made, and like, you know, really high heat conditions and drought have impacted the ability to use fire on the landscape. And so those are all things that a lot of people in, you know, grassland management generally are dealing with. So that is the most circuitous way to say, I'd love to put fire in the ground. We don't have a plan to right now, but maybe someday. Sorry, I'm going through the chat first and then I'll go through the Q&A because it's just kind of easier to do one than the other. How can you tell the difference between Japanese black pine and pitch pine? Hopefully I answered that question. I think what I'll do is I'll make a little infographic and maybe I'll put it on our social media account tomorrow. Because I should have made one specifically for this talk, but there's a few different things. I think that if you have a favorite plant ID book or app, there's lots of different ways to there's like bark and thing, but I think generally if you're on Nantucket or in a coastal area and there's some similar looking pines, it's generally, they're kind of short and scrubby. They're kind of called scrub pines sometimes, but the needle bundles are the best way. Okay, I have lots of nice things that people are saying. No mumbling detected. Thank you, Nick. Sometimes I talk very fast and when I don't have a room full of people like that, I can build off of. I have no idea if what people are responding to, so I appreciate it. Yeah, I think that was the end of the questions that I can see. If there's other questions or any follow-up or something I didn't answer, please feel free to type in again. I mean, just as I said, we're wrapping up, but as I said, even though we've been doing this since 2018, actively on the ground, we were planning for a little bit longer. And there's like the bulk of the pines are gone here. There's still work to do. And so we are going to be removing some smaller interior stands in the coming years. And it's an exciting time to see all this open landscape. And as I mentioned, we'll be continuing to update the story map on our website, which is under the stewardship tab. We will, I think, we'll be updating that with results and more pictures this summer. Because I mean, that's my favorite, right? Like looking at the pictures year after year. So really fun visuals. So, all right. Well, thanks everyone again for joining us today. Oh, here is one last quick question. Feel free to, if you have to hop off, but if there's any contact with Fisher's Landing Association regarding the survey with Fisher's Landing. So for those of you who don't know, Fisher's Landing is our nearest neighbor. They have a conservation buffer around their whole neighborhood, which abuts our Linda Loring Nature Foundation property. And we do share a lot of pine habitat. I don't know how much Japanese black pine Fisher's Landing has. There's some to the west, but a lot of our shared habitat is actually native pitch pine. And one of the things we have been in discussions with is being on the lookout for southern pine beetle. So myself and my colleague Libby Buck, who is on here today, have done some visual surveys for signs of southern pine beetle. We sent a report to the HOA at Fisher's Landing. We did not find any. There's other turpentine beetles and that kind of thing, but no southern pine beetle as of yet. And I know that the Fisher's Landing Homeowners Association has been working really closely with Bartlett tree experts to look at their pine stands for thinking about forest health, forest thinning. So I feel like that as a neighborhood, they're really on top of the pines in general. But yeah, we love to work with our neighbors. If you're a neighbor of ours too, we're always happy to talk, because the more we work together, the more resilient overall our habitats can be. Because they say as the crow flies, they don't know where those property boundaries are, so we do have to work together. All right, well, thank you everyone. We'll be sending around our recording of this in the next couple days, and thank you all. We hope to see you again at next month's Science Pub.